In today's video, we'll be talking about the set timeout and the set interval function, which once again, as with the past videos as well, I'm trying to look at the kind of things that beginners have the biggest trouble with. So in this case here, we're just going to jump right into the code and just talk about, first of all, the set timeout function. If we look at set timeout by itself, it's a function and it is a higher order function. It's one of the first few higher order functions you're going to encounter, probably together with array methods like map, filter, reduce, and so on. And what makes it a higher order function is that it takes as an input another function. And like I said, a lot of students struggle with this at the beginning, but really when you break it down like that, the set timeout function is very, very simple. So what we can do, for example, is we can say, well, set timeout is going to get a function passed into it, which is the thing to do. And the second parameter that the set timeout function takes is when to do it. And that's it. That is literally it. So if I now go and say const when to do it is going to be 5 seconds, right? So this is a millisecond. So in 5 seconds, we want this to happen. And then let's write a function with the thing to do. And that function is just gonna say hello in 5 seconds. Just like that. And now my function or my set timeout is already running. That is the majority of the thing that you want to do with set timeout. So now you see it's running, and after 5 seconds, we're hopefully going to see hello in 5 seconds right there. That is it. The confusion, why set timeout causes so much confusion for so many people is that, once again, the same thing as with array methods like map, filter, reduce, every, any, whatever, a lot of people write it like this. They write their function right inside of here and they go, okay, well, I'm only going to need it in this set timeout. So I'm just going to say right in here, console log hello in 3 seconds. And now my when to do it, I'm also going to change to 3000 milliseconds. And if I run this now, you're going to see everything else is still the same. We're now just going to see the output after 3 seconds. But the two code snippets are exactly equivalent. And if this doesn't make sense to you, why I can just plug in one thing into the other and why I can use like a throwaway function and what a throwaway function even is, you should check out one of my last few videos where I do go through exactly that. Now, there's also a way that, for example, if we say, I don't know, this should execute after 60 seconds, that I can actually stop it before it executes. Right? Because very often there will be situations in which we want to stop the timeout. So we're originally saying like, I don't know, the user should be redirected in 5 seconds, but maybe they're already clicking on a link and then we're saying like, okay, never mind. I want to interrupt that. So how can I do that? Well, the set timeout function will return an ID back to you that you can then use to clear that timeout. So in my case here, I'm just going to say const timeout ID equals to that, and we can, like I said, the set timeout function will return that. I'm going to rewrite this here just because I think for now it's a little bit easier to follow if we just say thing to do and when to do it. But in this case now, what I will do right after setting up the set timeout, I'm going to clear the timeout and give it the timeout ID we got back. And we can also log out the timeout ID right here, just like so. When I write it as an object, as I just did with the curly braces around it, I have a nicer formatting. You'll see that in a second. And here I'm going to say console log will kill the timeout now, won't execute. Okay, so what are we expecting here to happen? We want the thing to do be passed into our set timeout. We tell it, hey, in 5 seconds, do the thing. Now, what we get here is a timeout ID with which we have full control over our timeout, so that then here we're going to log out what timeout ID did we get back. This timeout ID we're going to kill. Then we clear it, and then we say here everything is done. Just like that. Now, if I run that, the only thing we want to see are these two console logs and this console log right here. So let me run that. And there we go. We get the timeout back like so. And then we see will kill the timeout now, won't execute. Now this output here, instead of just getting back a number, is actually something that is done by Node.js, because I'm running in a Node.js environment. You can, however, see how it also will work in the browser. I can copy the whole thing right here, run the whole thing, and you'll see that now our timeout ID is actually a number, right? So that's what I was saying before. We're going to get back an ID, and with that ID, we can look inside of our environment and say like, hey, whatever timeout exists with this ID, I want to stop it. Awesome. Now, this is set timeout done. There's nothing more to it. You can set something you want to have execute in the future. You can set the time until when it should be executed. And you can also intercept that action, that thing to do right here by just grabbing the timeout ID and saying, okay, I want this timeout to be stopped. If you understand all of that, let me write a comment here, set timeout. If you understand all of that, you will also very quickly grasp what set interval is doing. So let's look into that. Now, in comparison to set timeout, set interval will run every few intervals. Okay, that's the only difference. Otherwise, if we say we want to write the same pseudocode that we did before, we can say thing to do here as the first argument, and then we can say here every when, like every 1 second, every 2 seconds, every 3 seconds, whatever you want to pass into it. Otherwise, it's exactly the same thing. So let's, for example, say I go and say I have a count, I have a const, I'm going to call count, and that will be starting off at 0. Now, every 1 second, I want to count it up, okay? So every 1 second here, I'm going to go and say, in the thing to do, function thing to do, actually I have to find that already before, so maybe let's name this thing to do interval. So every thing to do interval, whenever that runs, I want to increase the count. And that also means I have to make this not a const, but a let. And then I can just go and say count plus plus, just like that. And then we say here, set the count to, and let's make this a string interpolation or template string, just like that, and put in the count. Now every when, like I said, I want to have this happen every 1 second. So I'm going to set this to 1000. I hope some of you are already seeing a problem with this thing, which is if I run this now, what we're going to be seeing is nothing for now. And then, I think my, okay, let's do this in the browser interface instead of the node environment here. Let's run it here. Okay. Now you see set the count to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4, and so on and so forth. Actually, this one here was killed now because of my set timeout in the top. But you see that this will just continuously count forever. There's not going to be a stop right here. It will count to 20, to 21. There's nothing here that stops it. So how can I actually stop my counter? Well, the thing is here, I will have to refresh my browser because I didn't keep track of the ID, but that's fine. I'm going to put that back in here. And now I can say, similarly, I can get an interval ID, just like that. And then I'm going to say clear interval with the interval ID. Now in this case here, I don't want to clear it right away as we did before. I want to clear it as soon as we hit 10 seconds. So how do I do that? Well, I can combine the two. I can say I'm going to set a timeout, and then I'm going to have this execute after 10 seconds. And what do I want to execute? Well, I want to clear my interval. So I can create a function right in here, a throwaway function. I'm not going to name it. And I'm just going to say clear the interval with the interval ID that we got back here. And I appreciate that this is now actually quite complicated, right? So we started off quite slow, but set timeout is also a really easy function. And now we combine everything that we've seen so far. I'm going to run this in the browser environment, just because here we can see how it counts up. So I'm going to run this, and we see now this is our interval ID. And we're now going to count to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. when we hit 10, it should finish. There we go. Nothing's running anymore. If we wanted to make this a bit nicer, we could have also said console log stopped the count after 10 seconds, just like that. Oops, just like that. If I'm just going to refresh here just so that I can run this anew in my browser environment here. If I run this, we're going to see it counting again, and then at some point stopping and then telling us, hey, we just finished this. And there we go. That's the power of set interval and set timeout. From time to time, you will encounter problems where you need to do something after a certain time, or things where you want to have things happening every few seconds. Now, very often that's going to be the case if you program like small little browser games. In those cases, you for sure are going to need those two functions, but there's also other situations, as I mentioned, like for example, a redirection comes to mind, or also something that should happen in like a few milliseconds and needs to be waiting a little bit. You will find these situations sometimes in more hacky situations, other times when it's actually the right solution. But just for that, it's really important to understand these concepts, because otherwise you will get stuck on these every time you see them. Now, otherwise, that's it for the video. Let me know if you have any other conceptual questions, any other concepts you want to understand better in the comments, and otherwise I'll see you next week.